Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to really unpack this sharp, highly critical piece of writing we received.
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating read.
It really is. It's titled The Ministry of Prominence, Manufactured Trust and State Media Control. And the core topic we're looking at today is this proposal by the UK's Starmer government.
Right, the one about online platforms.
Exactly. It essentially mandates that platforms, so think, YouTube, search engines, your social media feeds, that they must adjust their algorithms to make what they call reliable and approved public service news providers easier for you to find.
And, on the surface, that sounds like a very straightforward, maybe even completely benign administrative update.
It does. It really does sound like standard policy. But the source text we're analyzing today argues that it is, well, anything but benign.
Right.
But before we get into the mechanics of that argument, I just want to take a quick moment to speak directly to you, the listener, just to set some ground rules for this deep dive.
Always a good idea with topics like this.
Yeah, because the material we're exploring today contains some very politically charged critiques. It takes direct aim at government policy, it challenges legacy institutions like the BBC, and it touches on how heavy global conflicts are covered in the press.
It's heavy stuff.
It is. So I want to be unequivocally clear here.
Yeah.
We are not taking sides.
No.
We aren't endorsing the author's viewpoint, and we're not making any political statements of our own.
Exactly. Our goal is strictly to explore, deconstruct, and just understand the provocative arguments that are presented in this text.
Right, because regardless of where you stand politically, the actual mechanics of how information is curated and controlled in the digital age, that's something everyone needs to understand.
Absolutely. And to really grasp the author's critique of this policy, it helps to sort of visualize the dynamic they're describing.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this. Imagine for a second that you're walking into this massive, sprawling buffet.
Okay, a buffet.
Right, a digital buffet, and it has absolutely everything you could ever want to consume. You've got a plate, you're curious, and you really want to explore the whole spread.
Naturally.
But the restaurant manager has decided they know exactly what a healthy information diet looks like for you. So every single time you try to wander over to a niche independent dish in the corner, this manager physically steps in front of you.
Just blocking your path.
Exactly. Gently but firmly steering you right back to the steamed broccoli. And they look at you with this perfectly calm expression and say, we just want to make sure the reliable food is prominent.
That's a perfect way to picture it, because the manager in that analogy is the state, and they're armed with an algorithm.
Right.
The source text actually spends a lot of time deconstructing the specific phrasing the government uses to justify all this. This idea of ensuring the prominence of trusted news.
Which sounds so safe.
It does. But the argument here is that every single word in that phrase carries a hidden payload. Take the word prominence, for example. It's deployed because it sounds a lot less aggressive than, say, preference or algorithmic manipulation.
Yeah, prominence implies something naturally rising to the top, like cream, rather than something being artificially forced there.
Exactly. And then you have the word trusted, which completely bypasses the really awkward question of, well, who is actually doing the trusting?
Right, like, is it you, the viewer, organically deciding to trust a source because they have a good track record? Or is it some administrative committee sitting in a room deciding on your behalf what you ought to trust?
Which is a huge distinction. And by capping that phrase off with the word news, the policy creates this illusion that the beneficiary of this algorithmic boost is absolute objective truth.
When in reality,
it obscures the fact that these approved providers are actually massive legacy institutions. They have their own specific corporate interests, their own ingrained cultural habits, and, as the text points out, long documented histories of systemic failures and biases.
Yeah, so we really have to look at the official justification for this policy to see why the author finds it so flawed. The government's line, which is drawn from a green paper mentioned in the text, is that this intervention is about making our information environment more resilient.
Resilient?
Yeah. The underlying assumption is that the public is somehow struggling to locate these established, reliable organizations in the sort of chaotic sea of the internet. And therefore, we desperately need algorithmic assistance.
Which, let's play devil's advocate for a second.
Okay, yeah, let's do it.
Isn't it just the digital equivalent of a library putting the most reputable encyclopedias right by the front door? If an organization like the BBC is known to be a public service, making it more visible seems entirely logical, doesn't it?
It does seem logical, but the text dismantles that exact logic by pointing out a very basic, undeniable reality of British life. The BBC is not hard to find.
Oh, not at all.
Right. It is quite literally ubiquitous. It's on television sets, car radios, mobile phones, screens at railway stations, waiting rooms across the whole country.
Yeah, the author makes the point that every child in Britain grows up intimately aware of what the BBC is and exactly where to find it.
And that right there exposes a massive contradiction in the government's premise. I mean, if the BBC is everywhere and a viewer opens up YouTube and types in a search query for breaking news, they aren't doing that because they tragically forgot how to navigate to the BBC homepage.
No, of course not.
They're opening YouTube because they are actively making a choice to watch somebody else. They know exactly where the established news is, and they are consciously walking past it.
And this brings us to a really fascinating psychological concept the author outlines. They call it the managerial mind.
The managerial mind.
Right. To the managerial mind of the modern state, the distinction between a citizen who simply cannot find the approved message and a citizen who actively rejects it, that distinction is intolerable.
Wow. Okay. Intolerable how?
Well, if you simply haven't seen the state's message, you're viewed as unfortunate and you merely need to be informed. You need help.
Right.
But if you have seen the approved message, you understood it, and you decided you just don't buy it, you're viewed as insolent.
Insolent. That is a very strong word.
It is. And an insolent citizen needs to be corrected. This is where algorithmic prominence stops being like a helpful guide and starts acting as a digital ruler slap.
Ah, okay.
It becomes a mechanism to force the state-approved menu right back in front of your face, regardless of what you actually ordered, simply because your refusal to consume it is viewed as a threat to institutional order.
That makes total sense. So if people are consciously rejecting these ubiquitous legacy broadcasters, we have to examine what they're seeing that breaks their trust in the first place.
Absolutely.
Because the government assumes it's a visibility problem, but the audience's reality is that it's a credibility problem. And the text uses a really precise metaphor to explain this gap between literal accuracy and actual truth.
Oh, the bricks in the building metaphor?
Yes. The author writes, accuracy concerns the bricks. Editorial judgment determines the building.
I love that line.
Yeah.
Because you can take perfectly factual, verified bricks, right? And you can use them to build a house that is entirely crooked.
Exactly. A news report might not contain a single literal falsehood, but it can still be engineered to profoundly deceive the viewer.
And that distinction is the absolute core of editorial power. Institutional bias is rarely about a rogue reporter sitting in a room inventing fake news out of thin air.
Right. It's not comic book villainy.
No, it's about the power of curation. It's the authority to decide which facts are allowed into the room in the first place, which facts are made to stand quietly in the corner, and which facts are just never invited to the conversation at all.
And the source outlines several specific examples of this architecture, what it calls the language of authority.
The passive voice is a huge one here.
Yes, the careful use of the passive voice. You often see headlines stating that a neighborhood or a hospital was struck or, experienced an explosion, intentionally omitting the active subject.
Omitting the entity that actually dropped the bomb or fired the missile.
Right. And the psychological mechanism behind that linguistic choice is incredibly powerful because it shields institutions and state actors from accountability.
By creating this mediated reality where violence just sort of
Yeah.
happens, like a natural disaster or the weather, completely devoid of human agency.
Exactly. And over time, that shapes how the public assigns blame and understands cause and effect in global conflicts. The author actually ties that directly into how legacy media handles the contrasting treatment of victims.
This part was really striking.
Yeah. We see this building constructed of accurate bricks where victims on one side of a conflict are giving names, photographs, deep background stories, and tearful interviews with grieving relatives.
While victims on an opposing side are structurally reduced to mere statistics, and often with their death tolls heavily caveated as numbers supplied by an unverified or militant-run ministry.
Right. And that editorial choice fundamentally alters historical memory, and it alters civic empathy. It signals to the viewer whose humanity is actually worth recognizing and whose is merely a geopolitical data point.
The text also critiques the studio ritual of balance. We're all familiar with this format, right?
Oh yeah, the two talking heads.
Exactly. Two carefully selected guests placed across a desk to argue a very tightly constrained topic. And in these sanitized spaces, actual moral clarity or systemic critique is often treated as unserious or even childish.
While the artificial performance of balance is presented as sophisticated journalism, it just creates these artificial boundaries of acceptable thought.
Right. And the argument here is that modern audiences, especially younger demographics who have grown up natively fluent in how media is produced and constructed, they see right through this architecture.
They do. They don't just passively consume the news. They observe the language of the news. They see the bricks being mortared together. And once you realize the building is crooked, you just can't unsee it.
You really can't. And that realization naturally leads to a critical question about how these institutions operate behind closed doors. Because if audiences are detecting this systemic bias, why doesn't the institution just self-correct?
Right, because legacy media organizations like the BBC are, legally speaking, independent of the government. So how does the author bridge the gap from the BBC makes biased editorial choices to the claim that this represents a form of state media control?
Well, the text introduces this concept of the institutional weather,
Right.
and it phrases it as an ambitious employee knowing when to carry an umbrella.
I thought that was such a brilliant way to put it. It really struck me because it implies that the threat to journalistic independence isn't explicit.
No, not at all.
We aren't talking about some cartoonish dictatorship where a government minister picks up a red telephone, calls the newsroom, and dictates the evening headlines.
Right, you don't need a boss explicitly threatening to fire you if you can just look at the structural realities around you and realize you'd better play it safe.
Exactly. The most efficient form of control is always self-control. The BBC's independence is conditional and highly cultivated.
It relies on a royal charter. Its funding settlement is debated and determined by the government, and its governance structure is vulnerable to political appointments.
And the source notes that the government actually recently conducted a review of the broadcaster's governance and funding. So in that environment, editors and journalists naturally develop a really keen instinct for survival.
They learn how to read the room. They know which specific words will trigger an angry inquiry from a government office, which guests are considered serious enough to invite, and what perspectives are just considered beyond the pale.
Right. The ambitious employee looks out the window, sees the institutional weather shifting, and grabs their umbrella to protect their career.
And it creates this closed loop of acceptable discourse. The text describes this entire dynamic as a charade, because every single sentence in a broadcast might technically meet the formal bureaucratic standards of journalism. The institution gets to declare itself perfectly impartial.
There's a really striking quote in the text that summarizes this perfectly. It says, "The scales have been inspected and certified, therefore it is irrelevant that the weights were chosen beforehand."
Wow. Yeah.
Right. It's a rigged game that looks perfectly fair on paper, but the audiences realize the weights are pre-selected. So, where are they going instead? We have to look at the technological shift that actually shattered this monopoly.
The smartphone.
Exactly. The smartphone in everyone's pocket.
Now, the author doesn't romanticize the internet here.
No, not at all.
The text explicitly acknowledges that the internet is a chaotic mess. It uses the phrase, "the sea contains salt." It's filled with lies, frauds, and opportunists.
Yeah.
But it also contains something incredibly dangerous to a legacy media monopoly. Raw, unfiltered evidence that no broadcaster controls.
Right. Because everyone has a smartphone now, a viewer doesn't have to take the news anchor's sanitized summary as the final word. A user can watch a politician's entire 45-minute speech completely unedited.
And then compare it to the tiny, out-of-context, 5-second soundbite the broadcaster extracted for the evening news.
Yes, they can watch raw, shaky cell phone footage of a protest or a police crackdown or a conflict zone,
Yeah.
and they can compare that visceral reality to the sort of passive euphemisms used by the studio anchor.
And that habit of comparison is where the institutional authority breaks down.
Yeah.
Once a viewer repeatedly checks the primary source material against the polished broadcast, the legacy media's so-called professionalism stops looking like objective journalism, starts looking like a deliberate filter.
Or worse, as the author frames it, it looks like contempt for the audience's intelligence.
Right. And that massive gap in trust is exactly where the independent creator thrives.
Even though they might be biased themselves.
Exactly. Independent media might be highly partisan, but as the text points out, their partisanship is usually declared up front. A viewer knows exactly where the creator stands, which, paradoxically, builds trust.
Yeah, that makes sense. And furthermore, a small independent channel on YouTube or a podcast can dedicate 2 uninterrupted hours to deep diving into a single subject.
They can put primary documents right on the screen.
Right, and they speak in a recognizable human voice rather than adopting what the author calls the voice of God while thinking like a committee.
It really comes down to two fundamentally different views of the public. The independent internet model treats adults as judges.
Capable individuals who can weigh rival accounts, sift through the salt, and figure out the truth for themselves.
While the administrative state model treats adults as patients, fragile entities who need to be spoon-fed curated protection for their own good.
Which brings us right back to the ultimate danger of the Starmer government's proposal. If independent media is doing this vital job of filling a democratic gap and treating adults like judges, well, what happens when the government forces the algorithms to artificially prioritize legacy media?
And the text brings in a very critical, wider context here. Human rights organizations, specifically Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have raised severe alarms about this specific government's treatment of peaceful protest and civic freedom.
Yeah, they've pointed out failures to reverse anti-protest measures and warned about creeping authoritarianism in physical policing.
And the author elegantly connects that physical policing to digital containment. The algorithmic proposal is born from the exact same political instinct as the crackdowns on physical protest.
The instinct to control the narrative.
Right. The modern state understands that outright forbidding opposition or banning independent channels entirely, that just looks too authoritarian. It creates martyrs.
Yeah, you can't just ban things anymore.
No. So the goal isn't censorship in the classic 20th century sense. The goal is containment and friction.
And we have to think about how algorithmic throttling actually works mechanically, just from a user experience perspective. Normally, an algorithm on a platform like YouTube is designed to optimize for user retention.
Right. It watches what you click, how long you watch, and it serves you more of what you genuinely want to see. It's a bottom-up reflection of user choice.
But when a government mandate steps in to ensure the prominence of trusted news, it breaks that organic loop. The homepage of any app is finite real estate. I mean, there are only a handful of slots visible before a user has to scroll.
Exactly. If the algorithm is legally forced to artificially inject a BBC or legacy media video into the top 3 slots of your feed, regardless of your actual viewing habits, that action inherently suppresses someone else.
It is entirely zero-sum. By reserving the top shelf of the digital supermarket for approved broadcasters, that shelf space is actively stolen from a local grassroots reporter or a young documentary maker or an independent analyst.
You don't have to legally ban the opposition if you could just manipulate the code to push their investigations to page 50 of the search results, right? Because no one will ever see them.
It is a profound, stealthy form of censorship. The author describes this as a modern Orwellian reality. The state doesn't need to send a man in a trench coat with a red pencil to cross out newspaper articles anymore.
No, it just needs a recommendation system tweak and a polite consultation document promising to help citizens find trustworthy information.
Yeah, this suppression just happens invisibly. It's buried in the back-end code of the platforms we use every single day.
So, synthesizing everything we've explored from this source today, the government frames this algorithmic intervention as a necessary measure to build societal resilience against misinformation.
And the legacy broadcasters frame it as a vital public service that only they are equipped to provide.
Right. But the author cuts through both of those narratives, calling it exactly what they believe it is. Institutions that have bled their own authority, losing viewers to independent voices because of their own crooked architecture.
And now they are essentially begging the state to manufacture attention for them by force.
Exactly. The overarching takeaway from the text is that trust is not a commodity that can be legislated. It can't be delivered by an algorithmic order.
It can only be earned.
Right. You cannot force a population to trust a building when they already mapped out the crooked bricks.
That is perfectly said. And that leaves us with a lot to chew on regarding our own digital diets. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, building on all the realities we've just discussed today.
It's a really crucial question.
It is. The author suggests that the exact moment a government begins deciding which voices deserve algorithmic prominence is the moment that distrust ceases to be a public failure and actually becomes a civic duty. So think back to that digital buffet and that manager physically blocking your path, insisting they know what's best for you to consume. If the very algorithm designed to keep you safe from misinformation becomes the exact tool used to systematically blind you to the truths the state finds inconvenient, who gets to decide what your algorithm considers the truth tomorrow?